Hi guys, it's me Ria, and this is another episode of Bunka, a podcast where I am exploring the different avenues of Japanese culture around Aotearoa New Zealand. So this week I'm going to be talking about the collection of Japanese artifacts at the Auckland Museum. And I am quite experienced discussing the collection there because I did my dissertation for my master's on a collection of Japanese and international contemporary ceramics in the museum's collection known as the Green Gallery Collection. But before I talk about that, I want to talk about kind of the layout of the Auckland Museum so you know where you're going when you get inside. So there's two entrances. One's the South Atrium entrance, and this is the side of the museum that faces towards Newmarket, and you can see the domain fields. It's probably the bigger of the two entrances. Now on the other end of the museum there's the entrance known as the Grand Foyer, and this is the marble floored entranceway, and it's the one that faces out towards the harbour and the CBD. If you're looking to look at the Japanese objects in the museum, it's probably best to enter from the Grand Foyer. So the museum has a policy that if you are an Auckland resident, then you can get in for free. There's also a membership program where if you pay around $50 a year, you can enter all of the paid exhibitions for free. And for non-residents, there is a recommended donation, and for international visitors, there is a fee for entering the museum. Once in the Grand Foyer, there are two marble staircases on either side of where you're standing. And if you go up the marble staircase to the first floor, that's where you'll find the galleries containing Japanese and Asian artifacts. There's 3 galleries containing Asian artifacts in the Auckland Museum. There's the Arts of Asia Gallery, the Green Gallery Collection, and the Ancient Worlds Gallery. All of these galleries have an eclectic mix of countries which they display. So they'll have all parts of Asia in the Arts of Asia Gallery. They've got most of the ancient civilizations and their objects in the Ancient Worlds Gallery. And the Green Gallery is a display of contemporary ceramics by international artists. So not just Japanese, but also German, Kiwi, and artists of other ethnicities. In the collection, there is actually some Japanese war artifacts as well, but the works that are displayed tend to be older artifacts such as ceramics, fabrics and prints and carved Buddha statues and all those kinds of things. The Auckland Museum, which is actually the Auckland War Memorial Museum, has a lot of war history and objects relating to that within its collection, but these objects aren't always shown. They are on the online collections, and if you've listened to my episode about Canterbury Museum where I got a little bit passionate about the quality of an online collection, I find that the Auckland Museum has a really good collections online. In my dissertation I did critique it a little bit, but all in all, in comparison to other collections, it has a really high quality of their online collection standards. So you can see a little bit more about provenance, and you can search things you want to see essentially. And so if you go onto the aucklandmuseum.com website, go to Discover, click Search Collections, and then type in whatever you want to see. If you're really interested in those war-related objects, then you could look them up online and visit the museum that way. And if you're not one of those people that goes to museums a lot, most museums do have this kind of online presence to a capacity. So if you just like browsing and you don't want to actually leave the house, it can be a really cool way to kill time, just browsing the history and things like that throughout the country. So in the Arts of Asia Gallery, you'll see fabric, kimono, obi, those kinds of things, and there are wooden carved statue and bronze statues of Buddha that are also from Japan, and there is quite a lot of netsuke, which are little carved sculptures that used to be used as buttons, and clocks and ceramics. There is one object in this gallery that is my favourite, and that is a dress that's on display, which was designed by Issey Miyake, the Japanese designer, and the textile was designed by Yasumasa Morimura, who's a Japanese artist who I absolutely love. Some of you probably know Issey Miyake, but some of you might not. So Miyake was a world-renowned fashion designer from Japan. In 1960, when Issey was studying at Tama Art University in Tokyo, he was studying graphic design. He began to become interested in clothing as design as opposed to fashion. And 2 years after graduating, he was working in Paris as an assistant in fashion houses. After Paris, he had a quick stint in New York before returning to Japan in 1969. Miyake Design Studio was established in 1970. And Miyake was known for his experimental techniques. He was always trying to come up with something new, something different, something that hadn't been done, constantly thinking outside of the box. As you know, in Japan there are traditional textiles like kimono and things like that. And Issey was interested in these traditions, and there were some of these fabric making techniques that were on the verge of being lost completely. And so he visited historic sites to learn these traditions, which he would then use and practice within his own designs. So fast forwarding, Miyake began to experiment with pleats, and instead of cutting and sewing clothes from pre-pleated fabric, he began to make his own pleats by sandwiching them between layers of paper and then heat pressing them, which shrank them to the right size. And so it was in 1993 that Issey launched Pleats Please Issey Miyake line, which used his own garment and fabric pleating methods. And this is about the time that the artists began getting involved with the Pleats Please series. So in 1996, guest artists would work with Miyake, and this was when Yasumasa Morimura and Miyake created the dress which is on display at Auckland Museum. Issey was known for these pleated pieces. He was also known for the black turtlenecks that Apple CEO Steve Jobs wore. But it was earlier this year that Issey, at age 84, died of liver cancer, much to the sadness of many people all around the world. Now, the other contributor to this dress was Yasumasa Morimura, who was an artist who was born in Osaka in 1951, and his artworks as a photographer comment on issues in culture and sexual appropriation. Morimura studied art at Kyoto City University of Arts in 1985, and he is known for his self-portrait based works. So in his self-portrait photography, Morimura situates himself in place of the subject in iconic artworks and pop culture and history. So I love Morimura because he twists conventions on gender roles, and he often poses in the place of iconic women in art and pop culture. He also incorporates elements of Asia into his work to kind of deconstruct the void between the East and the West. Morimura says, "East meets West in my work, but I haven't made an attempt to merge the two worlds. They exist in opposition." And considering when he kind of came in to the art world and into creating his work, I think that this starts to have a comment on post-World War II Japan and the suppression of culture that occurred when the American forces were occupying Japanese territory, which meant that there was a lot of westernization in Japan, but also a lot of fear of being outwardly Eastern. In 2020, Morimura had a show at the Hara Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo, and it featured a new work called Ego Obscura. The exhibition that was held at the Hara Museum was a extension or continuation of an exhibition that was held by the Japanese Society in New York in 2018 and 2019, and it came at a time of important contemporary history for Japan because it was the time when the Olympic Games were meant to be held in Tokyo. Within that exhibition are one of my favourite of Morimura's works, Olympia, which he has made 2 renditions of, one in 1998 and one in 2018. And it also exhibits this work, Ego Obscura, in which he has stitched together both video and live performance to show some of the other characters that he's portrayed, such as the Emperor of Japan, Hirohito, General Douglas MacArthur, and Marilyn Monroe. And he tends to pick figures from both Eastern and Western history and public eye, and it kind of demonstrates the way in which Western life was incorporated into Japan after the war. I think it's important too to mention that Morimura's work, though he is a man, is quite important within kind of feminist art history because he deconstructs gender and the idea of the male gaze when he is reappropriating the way in which women were presented in art and pop culture. He is taking away this idea of the man's perspective and putting himself within those images as a way of subverting that concept. So I touched briefly on the fact that I did my dissertation on the Green Gallery collection at the museum, and I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time in the last year and a half talking with a woman named Kazuko Ito, and she lives on Waiheke, and she is one of the 2 donors of the Green Gallery collection to the museum. Sadly, her husband Shigenori Ito passed away, so I was never able to meet him, and they moved to Waiheke in around 2000, and their donation of the collection came off the back of them owning 2 contemporary ceramics galleries in Tokyo. And so their own personal collection had grown a lot from their possession of a gallery because they were showing current contemporary artists and helping them sell their works. They themselves were buying works and therefore growing a personal collection of their own. And as they got older, they decided that they wanted to donate some of that collection to the Auckland War Memorial Museum because they felt as though it would be a great way to bring Japanese objects and an education on ceramics to the people of New Zealand. The collection itself is a representation of how Japan and New Zealand have formed bonds, but particularly in the ceramics community in New Zealand, there are a lot of ties to Japan. There are a lot of ceramicists working in New Zealand and who have been potters here in the past, who have trained and travelled to Japan to learn the Japanese way of making ceramics. And in 2009, the director of the time of Auckland War Memorial Museum, Dr. Vanda Vitali, addressed the donation of the collection and having it in the museum as a privilege, because it was an acknowledgement of the special bond between Japan and New Zealand. Although the collection in the museum was not containing any New Zealand ceramicists' works, Kazuko told me that this was because they felt that by donating international works and Japanese ceramics, it was allowing New Zealanders to see the types of ceramics that they hadn't been able to see within their own country before. But there were New Zealanders who exhibited at the Green Galleries in Tokyo over the years, and within that there was James Greig, Christine Thacker and Bronwyn Cornish. And the relationships built between Greig and Shigenori was actually part of the reason that Shigenori and Kazuko eventually moved to New Zealand, because it was from James Greig's early death in Japan by heart attack which encouraged Shigenori to travel to New Zealand and see the country that his friend and companion had described to him, both in words and through his work. And one of the reasons that I became so invested initially in this collection was actually because of James Greig. When I was doing a project at university, I made the connection from the Greig family name, and I'd seen the name Greig before because I did an internship with Featherston and the POW camp. And it turns out that James Greig, the potter who had exhibited and trained in Japan, his father had actually been one of the guards at the Japanese prisoner of war camp in the Wairarapa in World War II. After a year's research on this collection, probably more, I wrote a lot, and I also discovered the lack of publications on the collection and the lack of information stored on the ceramicists within that collection. And I think I will eventually work on a bigger project about the Green Gallery collection, but I also think I will have another episode of this podcast where I talk to Kazuko in person. I haven't been able to organise that in time for this episode because she has been in Japan, and so I haven't seen her for a few months, but I do plan on going. Now, some of the standout artists for me within that collection are Takeshi Yasuda, Hakuko Ono and Kotaro Ono, among others. But these pieces aesthetically are stunning, and I would really encourage you to go look at them. The gallery itself, I believe, may be closing soon, so there might not be much time left to view them. However, I am hoping that the museum will display them within the Arts of Asia gallery, but perhaps not to the extent to which they could be displayed with their own cabinet. Now I'm going to leave this episode there, and hopefully I will be able to get around to making an episode about the Green Gallery collection itself and talking about the ceramic practice in New Zealand a bit further, because there are a lot of ceramicists in New Zealand who are working under the training of Japanese ceramicists, and it is a very interesting crossover between how the two countries work quite similarly with their practices. So if you would like to visit the museum, I definitely encourage you to do so. There's a lot of Japanese history tucked away in there, and there's a lot of history about Aotearoa and different aspects of the world, natural and human. And so I am going to see you guys in the next episode. Goodbye.